Hi, students. In the video this week, we're going to be talking about content from Chapter 6, and we're looking at construct validity in surveys as well as in observational research. Now, in class, we've been talking about concerns with construct validity in surveys, looking at format for questions and question wording. Now, we're going to shift gears and talk about encouraging accurate responses from our participants. So, in terms of encouraging accurate responses, one big challenge is that people often use shortcuts when they respond to questions. So, they answer in ways that aren't necessarily what they truly feel or believe or think. So, they engage in what's called a response set. So, they answer in a particular way. Now, for examples, we're going to be using questions that come from a publication that came out in 2012. And in this publication, they use an adult attachment scale. Within this publication, they were using it on a specific population of men that had engaged in domestic violence, but we're really most concerned with the scale for these questions. So the scale includes multiple questions. I've only given you a sample of 4 of them here. Um, so people would read the questions and then they would answer the questions on a scale that's not at all characteristic of me, somewhat not characteristic, neither characteristic, or not characteristic, somewhat, or very characteristic. And if you read the questions, you will see that some of them are reverse scored. So the very first question, I find it relatively easy to get close to others. The next question is worded in the opposite way. I find it difficult to allow myself to depend upon others. So we would expect people that were answering honestly should respond to those questions in different ways. So for some of these response sets, the first one we're going to talk about is called acquiescence or yay saying. And in acquiescence, people tend to agree with all of the items. So if somebody was engaging in acquiescence, they would agree with all of these items. They would say, this is very characteristic of me. But if they did that, they wouldn't be at least accurately responding because the questions are reverse worded. And so or reverse scored. And so they should, if they agree with something, if something is very characteristic of them, then they shouldn't respond the same way to the next question. But sometimes as a shortcut, people just decide they're going to agree with everything or say, yes, that's very much like me. Now, it's also possible that participants can do the opposite. They can disagree with all of the items. They might see the first one and not like that item, so that's not characteristic of me. And then they just kind of get it in their head that, okay, well, I'm just going to disagree with all of these. I don't like these questions. I'm going to just disagree with them. And so they might say, this is not characteristic of me. Now, again, if the questions have that reverse scoring, we will be able to tell if people are reading the answers and reading the questions carefully because they shouldn't be responding the same way to all of the questions. Another potential response set is what's called fence sitting, or I've also heard it called the cop out response. And this involves participants picking the most neutral of items. So if they pick something in the middle, so this is neither characteristic or not characteristic of me or neutral, that's fine for some items. But when somebody's engaging in this response set of fence sitting or copping out, they are picking the neutral item more. They are not showing how they really feel. They are picking the neutral item more than if than what you would really expect. So one way to at least handle this tendency to pick the neutral item is to remove the middle option. And so instead of giving 4 different options, get rid of the one in the middle that's neutral or this is not characteristic of me or neither or not characteristic of me because then people have to make a choice. Is it more like me or more not like me? All right, we're going to continue talking about response sets. Another possible response set is what's called socially desirable responding. And I've pulled the same questions over to this slide so we can see them again. So when somebody's engaging in socially desirable responding, they're trying to make themselves look good. It's sometimes referred to as faking good. So now this is a little more sophisticated response set than the yay saying. Now remember with the yay saying acquiescence response, they're just agreeing to everything. Now here, they're actually reading through the questions, but they're answering in a way that makes them look most positive, most favorable. So they're trying to look better. We do it. We want to look better than we are. We want to look smarter, stronger, happier, more successful, more well-adjusted, having better attachment. And so if somebody was faking good with this scale, they might say, I find it relatively easy to get close to others. Well, that's very characteristic of me. or I find it difficult to allow myself to depend on others. Well, that's not at all characteristic of me. But they're really trying to look better than they actually are. So it is a problem because they are not responding in the way that is accurate and authentic and honest for how they really feel. Now, the opposite is also possible. Your book doesn't really talk about this, but faking bad is another response set where participants try to look worse than we are. So, I find it difficult, I find it relatively easy to get close to others. Well, that's not at all me. And it's difficult to allow myself to depend. Well, that's very characteristic of me. Sometimes people go into these studies and they just really want to mess up the results. They're not disagreeing with everything. They're not agreeing with everything, but they're trying to make themselves look much worse than they really are. And that's problematic because that's not how they really feel. So, a question that comes up about all of these response sets is what can we do? I mean, we're giving people questions, we're hoping that they answer honestly. How can we encourage them to answer honestly and not to engage in one of these response sets? Well, one thing we can do is make sure that they understand that they are anonymous and we have no way to connect what they said back to their identity. And when people feel more anonymous, sometimes they feel more comfortable responding in an honest and accurate way. Now, for some people, if they know they're anonymous, they aren't going to care. And so they might engage in some of those response sets. But most of the time, we think that when participants feel more anonymous, they are more safe in responding based on how they truly feel. Another option is just to really encourage them to respond honestly and clarify to them why it's really important to provide honest answers. Sometimes it's difficult to know why a certain set of questions are being asked if you're a participant in a study. And of course, we don't want to tell participants our hypothesis, but anything we can do to say we really appreciate your honest responses, that is incredibly valuable to our research question. The more we can let them know that that is very important, and it's more important to have an honest response than than something else, then we're more likely to get some accurate, honest responses and not these response sets. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about surveys and construct validity of survey research. We're going to shift gears and talk a little bit about behavioral observations. Now, we've mentioned this in class. We talked about it a little bit in chapter 5. With observational research or behavioral research, a researcher is watching and recording the actions of participants. So they may be recording them with a video camera, they may be observing them and taking notes. This could be happening in the field, it could be happening out in the lab, it could be happening in the lab. Now, typically, observational or behavioral research occurs because we're trying to tap into things that are not really easily measured with self report measures. Um, if we're concerned about response sets, or if we're concerned that participants might not know how to respond to certain kinds of questions, we might decide to use a behavioral observation. And, we've talked about in class, sometimes we just can't give survey research out to certain kinds of participants. If we're interested in children and, they may not understand the questions. Um, there are individuals who can't participate in a survey. And so behavioral observational research gives us some of this information. So now your book talks about the study that is published by Mel, and remember they were looking at how much people talked. Now we could give people a survey and ask, well, how much do you talk on a daily basis? But I mean, would you honestly be able to answer that? Do you know that about yourself, and how would you measure that? So it's very unlikely people could give accurate responses regarding how much they talk on a daily basis. So what they did instead was they gave all their participants these electronically activated recorders here. And you can see this person is wearing their activated recorder. It's a microphone and a digital recorder. And they engaged in what was called time sampling. We're going to talk about this a little bit more when we get to sampling data. But essentially, they didn't have the recorder on all the time. They had the recorder go off and start recording every 12 and a half minutes it recorded, but it would only record for 30 seconds at a time. So every 12 and a half minutes, the recorder would go on, record for 30 seconds, and then wait another 12 and a half minutes, and then 30 seconds. Now, one of the reasons for engaging in time sampling is, we want to get a sample really of what's going on for the participants rather than getting an exhaustive, here's the entire day worth of data. So time sampling gives us that opportunity. And if you remember from reading about this in the book, this particular study, they gave it to men and women, and they were trying to essentially assess the stereotype that people tend to believe that women tend to talk more than men. And we could ask, well, do you think you talk? How much do you think you talk? But people, again, don't really know that. But they were able to collect this data across multiple locations, across different durations with different age groups. And essentially, what they found was there aren't significant differences in the amount of words that are spoken between men and women consistently, it's not consistent that women always speak more than men. There can be a lot of similarities, there can be some differences, but it doesn't support the stereotype that women consistently talk a lot more than men. Okay, I want to talk about two other behavioral observation kinds of research because the book talks about some, but I want to give you a sense about the variety of questions that can be tackled with behavioral research or when we're going out and watching people. Now, I think I've mentioned to you in class, I'm really interested in um, this new concept that's referred to as technoference, and that's the idea that when we are on our phones or on our electrical devices, we may not be as engaged with others in the world the same way if we were not on our phones. So just being on a phone, being on a device, we're different. We're different. And so there's a lot of research looking at how being on a device is related to parent-child interactions. So the first study we're going to talk about over here, it was published in 2021 and it was done in two countries, in the US and in Israel. And essentially what they were looking at is they were observing parent-child interactions in public places. So they went to playgrounds, and they did this both in the US and in Israel. And on their in their playgrounds, they observed 125 parents, and the parents were there with 157 children. And then they went to eateries. So think about like McDonald's and fast food kinds of restaurants, little family restaurants. And they observed 187 parents there with 160 children. So they have some really big sample sizes. You know, you might be thinking, well, how did they know how old the kids were? They had to make estimates and they grouped the kids into age groups of 2 to 3 year olds. And they had certain criteria for how they decided if somebody was a 2 to 3 year old, and then 4 to 6 year olds. And the child had to use the label, like mom or dad or whatever, the familial label for the parent to be coded as a parent in the study. So they didn't just look at children that were with adults in on a playground or children that were with adults in a restaurant. The child had to actually use a label that indicated that this was the parent. And they looked for a lot of things. They did 20-minute observations for each of the families that they recorded for the study. And they only wrote down what they saw. They didn't videotape them, they didn't audio tape them. They sat in these public places, playgrounds and eateries, and they took notes on what they saw. And they were specifically looking for how long the parent was on the device, if they were on a device during the 20 minutes. They also looked at eye contact between the parent and the child and any kind of language that was shared. How much did they talk to each other? What did they talk about? And so they collected data that's an example of a observational behavioral study. Now, the important thing to know about this study, and I have it up here, is that the participants didn't know that they were part of a study because this happened in public places, playgrounds, and in eateries where people go and they interact. The participants didn't give consent. They didn't get debriefed. They didn't know they were being observed. And, a lot of researchers think that's probably leads to the external validity of this particular kind of a study. If we tell parents we're going to observe you and we're going to look to see how much time you're spending on your phone in these different kinds of situations, that might affect how they behave. So it's just kind of important to know that this was a very naturalistic study that took place and the participants didn't know they were in the study. Now, the other study over here, again, it's really similar. It's looking at the same general area, and this was on the effects of maternal smartphone use on parent-child interaction. Now, because the word effects are here, I'm hoping that when you start to see this, you're thinking, "Oh, this must be an experiment." If they use that word effects, there has to have been a manipulation. So, yes, indeed. Now, the participants in this study did know they were in the study. They signed a consent form. They knew they were being observed for the study. So, let's talk a little bit about this one. So, in this study, they had 33 mothers of 2 and 3 year olds. They were toddlers, and they came into a lab on a college campus and they used a repeated measures design. So, it was an experimental design where all the participants were in all the conditions. Now, there's a lot of content right here, but here's the gist. The independent variable was there were 3 different levels of the independent variable, and they had maternal smartphone use. So they asked the mother in the room with the toddler to do something on the smartphone for 15 minutes. In another condition, they asked the mother again in the room with the toddler to read a magazine for 15 minutes. And then finally, for 15 minutes, they had the mother and the toddler engage in uninterrupted dyadic free play. Now, because you know about research and you know about experiments, you're probably wondering, did they counterbalance this? Did they shift around the order? Yes, they did. So some mothers were on their smartphone first, some were reading the magazine first, some were engaged in uninterrupted free play. But during this time, they videotaped them and they were really interested in how the mom would be interacting with the child during these 3 different levels of the independent variable, these 3 different conditions. So their dependent variable, they measured quite a few things. They measured the number of utterances. So how many words did the mom say to the child? They looked at how many responses did the mom give to the child. If the child asked a question, how many times did the mom respond? And they also looked at the number of conversational turns. How many times did they go back and forth when they were interacting with each other? So again, and in this study, if you're interested in the results, the publication reference is part of the slides here. They did find that when the mothers were on their smartphones, they engaged in fewer utterances to the child, fewer conversational turns, and they weren't as responsive to the child as you would imagine. They found the highest rates of being responsive in the uninterrupted free play, and magazine reading was somewhere in the middle. Okay, so you might be thinking to yourself, well, how do we do this? If we're trying to collect data and we're just watching people, how do we make sure that what we are watching is reliable and valid? So there are 2 things to be thinking about when we think about being reliable and valid with our observations. The first is what's referred to as observer bias. So in observer bias, this is really tricky because as a researcher, I have a hypothesis. I am observing families. If I'm thinking about those last 2 studies, I have expectations about what I think I'm going to see. So we want to make sure that our own expectations aren't influencing the way that we collect our data. So one of the ways to do this is to obviously engage in inter-rater reliability. So we have more than one person looking at the observations, and more than one person coding the data. Now, the 2 studies that we just talked about, the one that was done in the lab, the families were videotaped. And so, because they were videotapes, they could have 2 research assistants watching the tapes and coding for number of utterances and number of turns. The first study that we talked about did not. They only had a single observer that was taking notes and tracking. And so they even make a comment about that within the study. They have to kind of question inter-rater reliability because we don't know if the person who was taking the notes, that maybe something about their expectations. Okay, well, there's a parent that's on the phone. Let's see if they're talking more or they're talking less. I have these expectations here. We tend to see what we're expecting to see. So that was definitely a concern for that one study. Another issue that we have to be concerned with when it comes to observational research is what's referred to as observer effects. Now, we just talked about observer bias. With observer effects, this is something that's kind of similar to what we thought about in terms of a placebo effect. And we've talked about that with experiments earlier. When people know that they're in a study or they know that they're being observed, sometimes they change their behavior in accordance with, in expectation to what they think the researcher is looking for. So the participants essentially are confirming the observer's expectations. They're acting in the way that they think the observer wants them to act. And they're changing their behavior to fit the researcher's expectations. So there's several examples of this. The book talks a little bit about maze bright and maze dull rats. So definitely make sure that you read about that. But the most famous example of observer effects, where the individual being observed was able to pick up on the um, the subtle clues of the researcher, comes from the famous example of Clever Hans. And I'm sure you've heard about Clever Hans in your other classes. Clever Hans was an incredibly bright horse, and the horse appeared to add, subtract, multiply, and divide, have the equivalent mathematical skills of a fifth grader. And, people couldn't really figure this out. How is it that this horse can do this? Um, is his trainer tipping him off in some way? But what they found was it didn't really matter if the trainer was there. Hans could still count. But what they did notice, and they had to pay really careful attention, was that Hans was sensitive to detecting nonverbal cues. So if it didn't even have to be his trainer, if a researcher or somebody who's interested in testing him was trying to get him to do some kind of a mathematical equation, and how he counted, you might be thinking how he counted. He used his little hoof to count on the ground. Um, Hans would notice that the people around would start to give little nonverbal clues that Hans was getting close to the correct answer. They might shift their posture, they might raise their eyebrows, and Hans could pick up on that. And when the people that were testing him weren't able to give him those little subtle clues, they didn't know what the answer was when they would ask, and then they weren't able to give him those little clues. They weren't raising their eyebrows. He wasn't able to count. So he was able to pick up on the researcher's expectations and change his behavior to match it. So he was a very smart horse. He just couldn't count the way that they believed he could. All right. So preventing observational preventing observer bias and observer effects. Okay, one of the most important things that we can do if we're engaging in observational research is to develop what's referred to as a code book. Now, a code book, it has a list of our operational definitions for what we're observing. It just makes it super clear. Here's what we're observing. Here's what counts as an utterance if we're talking about the research with the children and their parents in the lab. What counts as an utterance? What counts as a turn? What counts as eye contact? So here we have an example that's pulled from a publication, a Campos et al. Study in 2013, and they were looking at emotional tone, and they had coders, as it says, rating extent to which the behavior of each parent was marked by verbal and nonverbal markers of coldness, hostility, or warmth, happiness on a Likert scale. So they had in their code book information about what does cold or hostile mean. So you can see here, cold or hostile emotional tone was defined as short communication, flat or angry affect, and no evidence of positive affect. So it's super important to know, what does cold or hostile mean. You need a code book which shows what that means, so that if there's more than one observer, they can make sure that they're using the same definitions. With respect to that, you also have to have a measure of inter-reader reliability. Ooh, got two things popping up at once. Inter-reader reliability is where you have two or more coders code and compare. And they kind of have that again down at the bottom of the paragraph here. Inter-reader reliabilities for emotional tone was 0.92. That's very good with the partner and with a child. So with respect to this study, they had very high inter-reader reliability. Another important component is to use the possibility of a mass design. Now, this can't happen all the time, but when you use a mass design, the people that are doing the observations or doing the coding do not know which conditions the participants are in, and they don't know the study hypothesis or goal. So, going back to the study that we looked at with the moms and the toddlers in the lab, and they were looking to see how much, you know, the verbal interactions that were happening between the mom and the toddler when the mom had a cell phone, when she was on a magazine, or when she was um, just in free play. If they used a mass design in that particular study, the people that were doing the observations, watching the videos, the coders wouldn't know which conditions the participants were in. So they would have only been like watching the videos and maybe listening. It would be hard in that one because they've got videos and you can see if the parents are on um, a cell phone or on a magazine. But if they were just listening, They wouldn't necessarily know what condition they were in, and it would be important for them to also know what the hypothesis is. If the researchers were expecting that the verbal interactions would be less in the condition with the cell phone, it would be important that the coders not know that expectation, so they wouldn't indirectly code in that way. They wouldn't allow their biases to influence. Okay. Another thing that kind of comes up, and we've talked about this in terms of the way people answer questions, is when you are observing people, it changes the way that they behave. Um, I've done lots of observational research, and when people know that they're being behaved, their behavior changes. There are a couple of ways to work with this. The first solution that is recommended is you try to blend in. You try to be as unobtrusive as possible. You might want to use a one-way mirror. You might want to use in the study with the toddlers and the moms on the cell phones. They used a camera, and I'm sure the moms knew the camera was there. They had to have signed a consent form, but that's definitely less obtrusive than having a researcher sit right there next to you with a little clipboard and be taking notes. So you want to be as unobtrusive as possible. Now, that's definitely what they did on the playground study. They were off, they weren't directly right next to the parents. The parents didn't know that this was happening. So, the more that you can blend in and be unobtrusive, the more likely you're going to get very naturalistic responses and you're not going to get a lot of reactivity. The other solution that is suggested is just kind of wait it out. I know the book talks about this was something that Jane Goodall did out in out in the wild. And you just hang out and you let your people that you're observing get used to you observing them. People tend to habituate to being observed. You get kind of tired of you're going to know at first, but you're going to get kind of tired of paying attention to the fact that somebody is just observing you. Um, in a similar way, the study when they were doing the recordings of the participants throughout the day, people just kind of got used to those devices being there. And you stop responding to it in that way. All right. So one question that comes up, and we're going to finish with this, is when you observe people, is it ethical for researchers to observe the behaviors of others? Um, the studies that we talked about, the one that we talked about in the playground study, those participants didn't sign a consent form. They did not know that they were being observed. This is a question specifically for observational research when people don't know they're being observed. So, the other study that we talked about, looking at the moms and the toddlers and the cell phone, that the parents knew what they were doing in that study. They knew they were being observed. So, we're not talking about the same kinds of ethical concerns here. But the question is like when you're just doing naturalistic observation and you're collecting data about people in public, is that ethical? Most researchers would say that it is okay to observe people in public places. And if you went through our institutional review board, our IRB, they would say the same that when you are observing somebody in a natural setting, in a public setting, it is okay to observe them. There isn't a need for consent under those circumstances because you're just observing what they are doing in a public place. So, playgrounds, restaurants, malls, college campuses, any kind of a setting, not necessarily in a classroom, but any kind of a public setting, it is okay for researchers to engage in observational research. Now, the important thing to remember is when researchers are doing observational research, they are measuring the behavior of the person. So on in the playground study, they weren't writing down anything specific really about the parents. They weren't capturing any information about the parents. They were just on a playground a certain day observing a family for 20 minutes and looking and just kind of measuring how much time is the parent on the phone, is the parent responding to the child's questions? So they're measuring the behavior. They are not connecting the data to the participants. So all the participants are anonymous. And obviously, this falls into the category of minimal risk because people are just interacting in their normal environments. Nothing is happening to them that puts them at higher levels of risk than anything in their day-to-day lives. So we're not connecting what we are collecting with the actual people in this that we are observing. Now, there are things to think about, though. There are some ethical concerns, and these are just questions. So, is it okay to take a photo or a video or an audio recording of somebody in a public place and use that for data? Well, we know that there are cameras in lots of places and they're collecting lots of data on a regular basis. Is that an ethical thing? Or can we use that data to engage in research? I guess it depends, right? What if you know the person that you are recording or observing? So if I were participating in that playground study and I saw somebody on the playground that I knew, would it be okay for me to be including them in the study? Because they're not anonymous to me. I know who they are. That is definitely a question. And when that has happened in observational research, usually the researcher just chooses to not include that person in the observations, but it's a concern. Another option, and it's a question and it doesn't have a straightforward answer, is well, when you've observed somebody, would it ever work to get their consent after the observation? And so now imagine this. You're at a playground and somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, I have been observing you for this study. Do I have your consent to use your information?" Well, I don't know. Wouldn't that feel just a little bit weird? So sometimes researchers try to do that. They try to get consent after the fact. The question becomes one of what are the risks and what are the benefits? So, are people better off knowing about the study and potentially getting upset and being suspicious? I don't know if I even want to go to this playground anymore. Um, or is it a bigger risk that they just not know? So it's always a matter of figuring out what are the risks to the participants and what are the benefits. And if there isn't a risk to the participants by them not knowing about the study, like it's probably better for them to not know about the study than to know about the study, then that might be the way to go. All right, so we're going to finish with this, and I will see you in class.